You know, I think we've all probably wondered at some point about what goes on behind closed doors in other people's lives.
Right.
Like almost everybody has probably thought about secret lives and stuff at some point.
Absolutely. The idea that someone could be leading this totally different existence right under everyone's noses.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And it's especially captivating when it comes to things like offshore finance, right? Because, like, that world is already so shrouded in secrecy.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's practically built for hidden dealings and all sorts of intrigue.
Right. So today we're going to dive deep into a story that combines both of those elements, secret lives and offshore finance, and at the center of it all, Mark Chikarovski.
Chikarovski, son of a prominent Australian political figure.
Exactly.
But he had a side hustle, you could say.
Well, more like a whole other life, really.
True, true. He was running a dark web drug empire.
Yeah, under the super catchy alias AusCokeKing.
AusCokeKing.
You gotta give him props for the branding, at least.
I know, right. So we're going to dig into all of that, how he built this whole operation, the lavish lifestyle he was living, and, of course, the offshore connections that were revealed in the Pandora papers.
We'll also try to understand what this whole case tells us about the intersection of crime wealth and that shadowy world of offshore finance.
So to set the scene, Mark Chikarovski, this guy selling everything from cocaine and meth to MDMA and prescription drugs, all through this dark web marketplace called Abacus.
And he's making serious bank-do, multi-million-dollar profits.
All under the radar.
At least for a while. And it wasn't just your run-of-the-mill drug dealing operation either.
What do you mean?
This guy was marketing his products like a legitimate business. Premium European imports, spring sales on cocaine.
Wow, he really did have a knack for the branding.
He did. Which actually makes you wonder what was going through his mind.
Like, why take all these risks when he seemingly already had a privileged life?
Right, like think about it. Family name with political connections, access to a certain level of wealth and social standing.
And yet he chooses to go down this path.
Exactly. It's almost like he was deliberately creating this alter ego, this AusCokeKing persona, to sort of break free from that predetermined path, maybe.
That's a really interesting angle. Like he had to create his own empire separate from his family's legacy?
Possibly. It's certainly something worth considering.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got this dark web drug lord raking in the cash.
Oh.
But how is he spending it?
Well, let's just say he wasn't exactly living a life of austerity.
No kidding. 2 Porsche SUVs, a $10 million home in Sydney with harbor views.
Private school fees for his kids.
This guy was living large.
He was. And that's another thing that makes this case so intriguing. This wasn't about hiding his wealth. He was flaunting it.
Yeah, almost like he wanted the attention.
It's possible. Maybe it was about fitting into a certain social circle, or maybe even trying to overshadow his family's legacy with his own success.
Even if that success was built on something illicit.
Exactly. It all points to a deeper psychological layer that we can't ignore.
Okay, so we have the dark web drug empire, the extravagant lifestyle. But here's the catch. Authorities say Chikarovski had no discernible income. So where was all this money coming from?
Well, that's where the world of offshore finance comes in.
Right. Enter the Pandora papers.
Exactly. These leaked documents revealed that Chikarovski was linked to a shell company called Aquay Holdings Ltd.
Shell company. So we're talking about a company that exists only on paper, basically.
Pretty much. It's often used to obscure the real ownership and control of assets.
And how is this shell company set up?
Through a firm called SFM Corporate Services.
Now, SFM, this is a company that's known for creating these complex offshore structures, right?
Like the architects of financial secrecy.
Okay, so they helped Chikarovski create Aquay Holdings. But how does that actually help him hide his money?
Well, one of the key tools they use is something called nominee directors and shareholders.
So these are basically stand-ins, people listed as being in control of the company, even though they're not the real owners.
Exactly. It creates a layer of separation between the true beneficiary and the assets, making it much harder to trace things back.
And in Chikarovski's case, we don't know for sure who those nominees were, do we?
That's right. And that's a really important detail. If they were just straw men existing only on paper, it suggests a certain level of sloppiness.
Like he wasn't that worried about getting caught.
Potentially. But if they were professionals with a veneer of legitimacy, it points to a much more sophisticated operation.
So that's one of the big questions surrounding this whole thing.
Absolutely. But remember, SFM didn't just stop at setting up Aquay Holdings. They went a step further.
Oh, how so?
They facilitated the company's operation in the UAE and the Seychelles.
Okay, so now we're talking about multiple jurisdictions.
Exactly. And to top it off, they helped Chikarovski open a second bank account in Cyprus.
Cyprus. another place known for its financial secrecy.
It's like a haven for those seeking to shield their wealth from prying eyes.
So we're looking at a multi-layered disguise for his money, each layer making it harder to trace back to him.
Precisely. And it was all working perfectly until the Pandora Papers blew the lid off the whole operation.
Right. So now the big question is, how did Chikarovski actually use Aquay Holdings? Was it just a simple matter of funneling drug money through it, or was there something more to it?
That's what investigators are trying to figure out. Was he transferring funds directly, investing in assets, laundering the money through a series of transactions to obscure its origins?
It's like a financial puzzle.
It is. And the Pandora Papers provide some of the pieces, but not all of them.
So it's still an ongoing investigation then?
Very much so. And that's what makes this case so fascinating. It gives us a glimpse into the real-world mechanisms that criminals use to exploit these offshore systems.
Yeah, it's a reminder that this stuff isn't just happening in some far-off land. It's happening right here, right now. And it's impacting all of us.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to understand how these systems work and to keep pushing for greater transparency and accountability.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the whole shell company stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
But we can't forget about the human impact of all of this.
No, absolutely not. You're right. I mean, Chikarovski's drug operation was fueling addiction out there, causing real harm to people's lives.
Exactly. And then there's the whole tax evasion angle, too.
Right. Which, deprives governments of the resources they need to provide essential services. It's not a victimless crime by any means.
No, not at all. It's like these ripples just keep spreading outwards.
Yeah.
Affecting way more than just one person.
You know what's crazy? I keep thinking about that picture of Chikarovski getting arrested. Like him stuffing drugs into an Australia Post envelope wearing those blue latex gloves.
In that Bondi Junction apartment.
Right. It's such a strange juxtaposition. Like, here's this guy living this super high-rolling lifestyle.
With the Porsche SUVs in the multi-million-dollar home.
And yet he's caught red-handed doing something that seems almost amateurish.
It does make you wonder, though, if he was making so much money, why take those kinds of risks?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe it was overconfidence, or maybe he just underestimated how much scrutiny his activities would attract.
Or maybe a little bit of both.
Yeah, could be. And it's not like the authorities were just stumbling around in the dark either. They seized a ton of evidence during those raids.
Oh, yeah. What kind of stuff?
Drugs, obviously. Large quantities of them. And cash. Plus, they found a significant amount of cryptocurrency, too.
Interesting. So they were able to connect some of that digital wealth back to him.
It seems so. Which just goes to show how lucrative this kind of illicit business can be. But it also makes you wonder if our systems are even equipped to deal with this level of financial sophistication.
Like, are we always going to be playing catch-up?
It's a valid concern, and it's something that we definitely need to address. I mean, at the end of the day, Chikarovski pleaded guilty, right?
He did. And he was sentenced to 35 months.
A 35-month intensive corrections order, to be exact, which included home detention, community service, and mandatory mental health treatment.
I remember his defense team argued that he turned to drugs to cope with the pressure of being the son of a prominent politician.
It's a reminder that even in these high-profile cases, there's often a complex human story behind it all.
Yeah, it doesn't excuse the harm he caused, of course, but it adds another layer to the whole thing.
It does. And it also brings up an important question. Are we doing enough to address the underlying issues that might lead people down these paths?
And are we doing enough to close the loopholes that allow people to hide their wealth and potentially evade accountability?
That's the million-dollar question.
Or in this case, maybe the multi-million-dollar question.
Right.
So where do we go from here? I mean, what are the key takeaways from all of this?
Well, for me, one of the biggest lessons is the importance of transparency. We need to be able to see through these offshore structures and identify the true beneficiaries of these companies and accounts.
So basically shining a light on the dark corners of the financial world.
Exactly. And we need international collaboration, too. Intelligence sharing and sophisticated investigative techniques. If we're serious about combating financial crime on a global scale...
It sounds like a pretty daunting task.
It is, but it's not impossible. And cases like Chikarovski show why it's so important to keep pushing for change.
Okay, so we've talked about the dark web drug empire, the lavish lifestyle, the offshore connections, and the legal fallout. But let's zoom out for a second. What broader lessons can we take away from this whole deep dive into the world of Mark Chikarovski, the AusCokeKing?
I think for me, it's that reminder that things aren't always what they seem. You know?
Yeah.
Like you see the fancy cars, the big house, and you just automatically think success. But, like, there's often a whole other story going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in Chikarovski's case, that hidden story is all about illicit activities, concealed behind all these layers of offshore companies and bank accounts. It's like a reminder that we can't just accept everything at face value.
We need to be a little bit more skeptical.
A little bit. I'd say a lot more skeptical.
True. It's like that saying, right? If something seems too good to be true, it probably is.
Exactly. And that applies to way more than just potential criminal activity.
Well, absolutely. It's a good life lesson in general.
Yeah. Like learning to spot those inconsistencies, learning to think critically. Those are valuable skills. Definitely. And I think what's really interesting about this whole case is how it connects to these bigger issues that we're all dealing with.
Oh, totally. Like the whole rise of online crime, the challenges of regulating the dark web, the global fight against money laundering. It's all connected.
And Chikarovski's story. It's like a perfect example of how these things are playing out in the real world.
A microcosm of these broader trends.
Yeah, exactly. So we've gone from a seemingly ordinary guy to a dark web drug lord. We've uncovered a lavish lifestyle built on illegal profits. And we've traced this tangled web of offshore accounts and shell companies. It's been quite a ride.
It has. And while we've learned a lot about Mark Chikarovski and his double life, I think the biggest takeaway for me is the need for continued vigilance.
Like we can't just let our guard down.
Exactly. We need to keep asking questions, keep pushing for transparency, and keep holding those in power accountable, no matter what field they're in, whether it's finance, politics, whatever.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
We can't afford to become complacent. The fight for a more just and transparent world is an ongoing battle.
It is. So to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to check out the ICIJ's Pandora Papers investigation. We'll be sure to include some links in the show notes.
It's an incredible resource. Really shines a light on those hidden networks of wealth and power that shape our world.
And as always, keep those minds curious and those questions coming. Until next time, happy diving.